Like many Black South Africans my age, I spent a significant part of my life in a rural area. My grandmother was a peasant farmer who grew most of the food that she needed, and often with enough surplus for extended family in the cities. And back then, I remember my grandmother always spoke about how things had changed. She spoke about how the cropping season had shifted. She spoke about how many crops that had characterized her youth, she could no longer plant. And so in many ways, she spoke about her own observations and interpretations of what was a change in the weather pattern. Looking back now, it's clear that my grandmother was talking about climate change. And she was using her own words and her own experiences, her own vocabulary to describe a change in the climate. But like many of us, she spoke about it as a then and now, and not as a continuous process that's ongoing. And I say this because in the 19th century, Charles Darwin popularized the term survival of the fittest. It was based on his evolutionary theory of natural selection, where he postulated that with the environment continuously changing, species had to adapt. And it was the adaptation or ability to adapt that kept species in perpetuity. Now, Darwin's theory was based on two fundamental assumptions. The first is that clearly the environment is changing on an ongoing, as a matter of a cause. The other is that species have sufficient variability in them to then use the adaptation or to require adaptation to perpetuate their own stock. Now, when I apply Darwin's the first assumptions to climate change, it's clear to me that climate change must be seen in the context of an ever-changing environment. And that is not to say that we haven't accelerated that change. But for me, it has to be seen in the context of an ever-changing environment where adaptation is second nature to all species. Now, my grandmother, having described climate change, was also talking about some of the things that they had done as part of her community to adapt to climate change, in terms of planting different crops, in terms of looking at changing certain, what time the crops get planted, and so on and so forth. Sometime in the middle of my career, I took an interest in climate change, and together with some researchers set out to develop what we called at the time a household vulnerability index. So this was going to be a scientific measure that would assess household level vulnerability to climate change. Now, many such indices have been developed over time and continue to be applied as a means of this assessment. And most of these indices have common inputs. Those inputs, some of those inputs include looking at the structure of the housing, the material used in building the housing. It looks at financial resilience within households. They look at human and social capital. They look at the extent to which households are dependent on natural resources. I am yet to see an index that actually incorporates indigenous knowledge systems into their matrix. One that acknowledges that this is happening, and in fact, communities like my grandmother's are at the coalface of the impact of climate change. And they have lived with this, forever. And yet we lose out on the opportunity to incorporate what they know, what they've learned, the knowledge that they have acquired into the tools and the frameworks that we use in this conversation. In about 2019, Cyclone Idai caused a lot of devastation in the southern part of Africa. The eastern part of Zimbabwe was also impacted. At the time, we were interested in looking at the relationship between women and climate change, so the gendered impact of climate change. So we set out talking to some of those families, that had been impacted. Now, there were 2 villages which were adjacent, and one would have expected that those villages would have been impacted the same. Now, when we went out and spoke to those villages, both of them said, we heard something in the news. They were talking about heavy rains coming. We were not sure what was expected of us. So they didn't quite know what the ask was. But in the one village, in addition to what they heard, one of the elders said, we saw insects. Now, we've always associated these insects with heavy rains. But we saw these insects in numbers we had never seen before. And on the basis of that, they evacuated all their livestock uphill. They took women, pregnant women, little babies uphill. And that village suffered far less catastrophe. So, what is indigenous knowledge? It's knowledge that is acquired over time through man's interaction with the natural environment. Often it's passed down through stories that are told, through riddles perhaps, through idioms, and sometimes even through the use of taboos. In fact, as I was preparing for this talk over the last couple of weeks, I spoke to my young sister, who happens to have spent, was fortunate enough to have spent a bit more time in the village than we did. And she shared with me how, as young girls going out to fetch firewood in the forest, there was a particular tree species they were told never to cut. Now, the reason that was given, wait for it, they were told if you ever cut that tree, you would not be able to bear children. Now, it sounds laughable, the link between cutting a tree and your fertility as a woman. But when we dug a little bit deeper, we discovered that that particular tree has a very complex root system that actually preserves soil moisture. So what was punted as a spurious reason for not cutting the tree was actually based on some sound ecological science, if you will. And there are many such examples all over. If you think about how communities have used the position, the movement of the sun, the moon, to interpret and predict weather patterns, how they've used morning dew sometimes. The sound of animals is a common one. Some smells have been associated with this or the other. But this is knowledge that exists in our communities. Knowledge which, in our climate action plans, we are failing to tap into. Knowledge which would not only contribute to the body of knowledge that we have, to the science that we have, but also help demystify climate change. Because the people who are likely to be most impacted by climate change are not the people in this room. It's not the people who understand climate change and the science behind the climate change. So when we talk about these communities about climate change, it's very abstract. If you look at it at a global level, the IPCC, which is a report that is released from time to time that talks about climate change and what actions need to be taken, it acknowledges that we need to incorporate indigenous knowledge systems. But very little has been done. And they argue that this is because it's very difficult to get these knowledge systems because they pass down from generation to generation. Some of it sits in gray literature, and it's not peer-reviewed. And again, that's the problem, because we've framed the climate science through this very narrow scientific lens. And so, if you look at the South African context, we've got the Climate Commission, which is mandated with looking at our just transition or managing our just transition. That Climate Change Commission is made up of mostly experts and academics. Mostly experts and academics. There aren't any resource people from communities that have lived this and continue to live through it. So again, a missed opportunity, because our climate action plans identify these communities as merely victims of climate change. They are not seen as resources that we can tap into. Going back to my grandmother, it's clear to me that her community used indigenous knowledge to predict weather patterns, to interpret and predict weather patterns. They used indigenous knowledge as part of their bioconservation efforts, as part of sustaining the whole ecosystem. They used indigenous knowledge as part of their adaptation process through, using different water harvesting methods, using different cropping methods, planting at different times, and so on and so forth. And all those were important adaptations. And like the village in Zimbabwe, they used their indigenous knowledge as part of their disaster mitigation plan or disaster mitigation strategy. So what I want to leave with you is we need to act now in terms of mainstreaming indigenous knowledge into our climate action plans. Thank you for listening.